Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this is History 11. The title of today's lecture is Three Worlds Meet. And the main point we are trying to make in this lecture, the thesis statement, is on your screen. People from three highly developed, complex societies, Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans, came into contact with each other in the land that came to be known as British North America. The interaction of these three groups of people, to a large degree, is the story of the American people. Three worlds meet. Sometimes it's a story of culture clash. Sometimes it's a story of cultural cooperation. But those interactions make up the history of our country. The first question that historians have to address is who was here in North America or in the Western Hemisphere before Columbus came? The history of Native Americans is long and important. The history of humankind in North America began probably about 12 to 14,000 years ago when nomadic bands came from Siberia across a land bridge, now underwater, that connected Asia with Alaska. That piece of land that is now underwater, but it's called the Bering Land Bridge. You can see here the likely way that people walked over 12 to 14,000 years ago. Here's another view. Some scholars say the majority of people came from Central Asia into Alaska in one direction. Some say they followed a coastal route. Probably it was a little bit of both. Here you can see another view of the Bering Land Bridge as it appeared at that time. They're diverse societies. These nomadic hunters followed vegetation and game south and east until they had spread through North and South America. By 1500, when Europeans began arriving on these shores, these Native American Indians, as they were called, had developed into many different peoples with different cultures, languages, and forms of social organization. You can see from this map on your screen the diversity of American Indians just within what is today the 48 states of the United States. Various groupings, the Northeast Indians, the Northwest, the Southwest, and so on. So over time, they spread out, they develop, they differentiate, although in the beginning, they probably descended from a very small group or very closely related group of ancestors. In order to build civilizations, people need to have a stable food supply, and usually located by water. So these early indigenous Americans in the beginning were hunters and gatherers, but over time they became hunters and farmers. By 14,000 BC, Native Americans began to use stone-tipped spears and to choose kill sites where they were able to destroy entire herds of Pleistocene mammals at one time. And here you can see the various stone-tipped spears that anthropologists have uncovered. With a more reliable food source, the population of American Indians expanded and then migration diminished. That is, they could stay in one place. And anthropologists talk about the agricultural revolution. What that refers to is the ability of Native Americans and other peoples around the world to develop a stable, not only to develop a stable supply of meat, but to grow grain so that they don't have to go long distances to find meat, but they can raise large herds of domestic animals and then have a nearby food supply. An agricultural revolution occurred in ancient Egypt, among other places, and helped give rise to a civilization there that endured for more than 3,000 years. And here you can see some ancient Egyptian art that shows the transition in Egypt to less of a nomadic lifestyle and more of a settled agricultural life with villages and so on. An agricultural revolution over time, of course, gave rise to very complex civilizations. A larger, more dependable food supply based on plant life led to additional population growth, sedentary village life, and greater political and social complexity. And here you see Native Americans who have sort of begun to form small villages. Indians also used grinding stones to grind grains that they had grown during the shift from hunting to farming. And then agriculture continues to develop through the early Middle Ages and into the modern era. Between 500 BC and 1500, North American Indian societies grew and became much more diversified. In the Southwest, what is today the Southwest United States, the Pueblo people built planned villages of terraced buildings. They developed irrigation systems and became skilled potters and weavers, engaging in some cases in long distance trade. Mound building societies appeared in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Later, the Mississippi culture built elaborate cities and ceremonial structures and extended its influence over a very large area. Various woodland tribes in eastern North America utilized land, water, and the forest and developed complicated social and political organizations. Here you see a reconstructed view of Cahokia. Cahokia, not far from modern-day St. Louis, Missouri, just across the river in Collinsville, Illinois. Cahokia was the largest urban area in pre-Columbian North America, with an estimated 20,000 inhabitants inside its palisaded walls. And not being close to the Mississippi River, Cahokian residents engaged in long-distance trade. And archaeologists have found artifacts here from the Caribbean and areas outside what is today the Gulf of Mexico. Here's another view of Cahokia, the largest city in North America before Columbus arrived. Concerning trade, American Indians developed their own complicated trade systems and trading networks. Historians often focus on what's called the Hopewell exchange system. The Hopewell tradition, as one scholar wrote, was not a single culture or society, but represents a widely dispersed set of related populations. Hopewell groups were connected via a common network of trade routes known as the Hopewell Exchange System, which extended, as you can see on this map on your screen, from the southeastern United States to the southeastern shores of Lake Ontario using the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. Within this area, societies participated in extensive exchange, especially along major waterways. So rivers were the roads of those days. And so Indians are very sophisticated traders. And there's a great deal that we could learn about this at another time in greater detail. The point of showing these elaborate, diverse, complicated Indian societies is that Europeans did not come to an empty wilderness as they sometimes claimed, but instead Europeans, the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and others, they came to a land that had been populated for thousands of years by people whose village existence and whose city and whose urban existence, in a few cases, resembled that of Europeans. So North America was not an empty wilderness. It was an inhabited area by people who had undergone millennia of development and advanced development. Now, it's important to know that American Indians and Europeans looked at the world differently. They looked at life and the universe, religion and trade in very different ways. And that, of course, the difference in the way people look at things sometimes explains why people don't get along, because how people think influences how they act. Now, historians have identified at least 5 different areas where Indians and Europeans looked at the world in different or contrasting ways. A contrasting view is where things are different. So there are at least 5 ways that Europeans and American Indians looked at the world differently. One had to do with the natural world, another had to do with land and property, kinship, trade, and religion. Europeans, whether they were English or French or Spanish or Dutch or Portuguese, saw the natural world as a resource for human use, while Native Americans saw every part of nature as sacred and filled with spiritual power. The idea that humans should control nature, which is what Europeans tended to believe, where did that idea come from? Many European Catholics, Protestants, and Jews believed that human beings should control and dominate the natural world. That idea came from a substantially shared interpretation of the Bible, particularly the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 28, which I've put up here on the screen to show you. And the verse reads like this: "Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." The word subdue is important. Fill the earth and subdue the earth. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. The Hebrew word for subdue is kabash, which means to tread with the feet, to trample underfoot, to subject, to subdue to oneself. So the idea that many Europeans had, to a greater or to a lesser extent, was that the natural world was hostile. There were floods and fires and earthquakes and hurricanes, tempests and plagues and so on. And so you had men and women had to sort of conquer or sort of master the earth, subdue it like that. And so that's a view that they have about nature. Native Americans, on the other hand, tended to have a much more harmonious view of nature and human beings. Where did that idea come from? Some scholars have applied the term animism to Native American religions, arguing that Native Americans believed that trees, rocks, rivers, plants, and animals are spiritually alive or have spirits. The spirits that exist in nature have the power to help or to harm. If the supreme being or a spirit lives and manifests in nature, nature should be respected and cared for. Therefore, in the view of many Native Americans, though certainly not all, nature is not seen as an object to be tamed or subdued by humankind. Rather, humans must seek to live in harmony with nature. So it's a very different view, and of course led to substantial disagreements between Europeans and American Indians. Another difference between Europeans and Native Americans concerned land and property, the ownership of land and the ownership of property, personal goods. Europeans believed in private ownership of land and tended to see property as a sign of independence, wealth, status, and even individual identity. Native Americans, on the other hand, practiced communal ownership of land, which of course limited the gap between the rich and the poor within Indian societies. If someone takes a great deal of personal worth or identity from possessions, some psychologists have asked this question: are we the sum of our possessions? A key to understanding what possessions mean is recognizing that knowingly or unknowingly, intentionally or unintentionally, we regard our possessions as parts of ourselves. That we are what we have is perhaps the most basic and powerful fact of consumer behavior. We regard our possessions as parts of ourselves. As somebody once said, clothes make the man, or clothes make the person. Believing that who we are comes from what we own and from what is on the outside, rather than coming from who we are on the inside. Another important difference between Native Americans and Europeans concerns kinship, how societies and families are structured. Many Native American societies were matrilineal, a system of descent in which kinship is traced through the mother. In such systems, the important relatives for men are those men who are related to the mother, who we can trace their ancestry down from a particular matriarch. But most European societies were patrilineal, a system of descent in which kinship is traced through the father. So it's sort of like it would be like going to a family reunion on your mother's side, that's matrilineal, or going to a family reunion on your father's side, that's patrilineal. Another big difference between Native Americans and Europeans concerned trade and religion. Let me back up briefly. Trade was a way that Indians could preserve what we call reciprocal equality between individuals and communities. Whereas for Europeans, trade was a way to acquire goods and did not have the same social and spiritual function. So Native Americans were very aware that trade the buying and selling of goods could rupture a relationship. So Native Americans wanted to be sure that the relationship that they had with a person or a society would be the same after the business deal had concluded than before. So Native Americans would bring their best goods, but they expected Europeans to do the same. When Native Americans, as you can see in many portraits and European drawings, when Native Americans bring their best goods, Europeans tend to think that they will be easy to take advantage over or get over on the Indians. But Indians were very sophisticated. They understood that they were bringing their best, but they expected Europeans to do the same. Another difference concerned religion. Europeans built their lives around their belief in a single God. We call that monotheism. They had a single God or one God. They tended to have written scriptures and organized clergy and churches and so on. But Native American religions were much less structured. They tended to be polytheistic. Even if they believed in a big God, they often believed that the little gods could take you to the big God. And they tried or sought to suffuse this world with heavenly power. Now, point 2, Africa on the eve of contact, meaning contact with Europeans. In the early years of contact with Europeans, Africa was seen as a continent with very diverse cultures that had evolved over a very long period of time. That is, most Europeans who came to Africa, especially in the 15th century, found great kingdoms, with powerful chiefs and strong economies, advanced systems of governance and language and religion. Europeans did not necessarily agree with all of those beliefs, and vice versa. Africans did not necessarily agree with Europeans, but the Europeans recognized who the Africans were, and they saw their greatness. Later on, however, when the slave trade started, many Europeans began to argue that Africans were backward, that they were not, in fact, sophisticated and advanced and highly developed, but they were backward and in need of white supervision and oversight. That, of course, was, as we will see in a later lecture, that was a justification or a way to rationalize and explain away the slave trade. But the original view that Europeans had of Africans was that Africans were highly sophisticated. Approximately 50 million, not 15, but 50, approximately 50 million people lived in Africa in the 15th century. Many empires founded on iron production and agriculture had risen not only in Egypt and south of Egypt and Nubia, but in West Africa as well. This map you see on your screen was, in the view of many cartographers, the standard map for Africa for the last 25 years of the 16th century. This map of West Africa or sub-Saharan Africa shows us 3 very large kingdoms that had arisen over long periods of time. The first of these great kingdoms was Ghana, in the green on this map on your screen, not to be confused with the original, with the modern or present day nation of Ghana. Ghana was one of the earliest empires in West Africa. It had very large towns, long distance commerce, and it specialized in the gold trade for Europe. It fell after a Muslim invasion in the 11th century. Ghana was succeeded by Mali in the orange on your map. It took in most of original Ghana, but it went further south to take direct control of the Wangara gold mines that were there. And it extended deeper into the central Sudan. This Islamic kingdom, Mali, had a flourishing economy and an intellectual life that made Timbuktu not only a crossroads for trade, but a crossroads for culture. And even though it was an Islamic empire, it had a measure of religious tolerance toward other religions. But it was taken over by Songhai in the blue. And Songhai, of course, became so extensive that over time, it became very, very difficult to hold together. And it began to collapse in the late 13th century. And of course, one of the great strengths and beauties of these West African kingdoms was that they were able to unify smaller tribes that would have otherwise been separate and at odds with each other. And as long as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were in existence, it was virtually impossible. It would have been virtually impossible for Europeans to begin a slave trade. But when Songhai collapsed and was not taken over by any other large political entity, the glue, the political glue that had held these empires together sort of broke apart. And the unity broke apart. And West African societies reverted or went back to their more tribal existence. And when that happened, it was a very ominous development, because then Europeans could choose a tribe, arm it, and pay it vast sums of money to bring in captives from another tribe. So the loss of political unity was very, very damaging. We should mention a little bit about what we call the African ethos, or the African worldview. Most African cultures differed from European cultures in several ways. The basic social unit in Africa, as in Europe, was the family. But African societies organized in a variety of kinship and political systems, and many of those systems, like the systems of Native Americans, were matrilineal. Also, West Africans tended to believe in polytheism and ancestor worship. That is, they believed in many gods, just like Native Americans did. And they also believed in ancestor veneration or ancestor worship. So they believed that ancestors had left this world, but they still cared about the loved ones they had left behind. So there's a great emphasis in West African cultures on departed loved ones. The social structure in West Africa was also had ranks and levels like a ladder, which of course every society does. At the top would be the royal family, wealthy merchants, military leaders, all the way down to the very, very poor. And at the bottom of African society, there were slaves. But the African kingdoms were magnificent cultures. And in the beginning, Europeans recognized that tremendous historical importance of them. Point 3, Europe in the age of exploration. Now, Europe had been unified under the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire collapsed in the 4th century. So Europe, Western Europe, what would be today England, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, that area there had declined considerably and was what one historian called an economic and cultural backwater. It really had no vitality left at all. This map shows the end of the Roman Empire, the last stages of it, about a century after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. By the 9th century, Western Europe really was an economic and cultural backwater. All the vitality of the Roman Empire, the old Roman Empire, had shifted to the east to Christian Byzantium and Islamic nations. Now you can see here these yellow areas to the right, and there's a red arrow. Yellow areas show what remained of the Roman Empire by early in the 6th century AD. So, but everything to the left was only a shadow of its former self. This map from 1422 shows Constantinople. If you allow me to go back one map here, where that red arrow is, that's Constantinople, which today would be Istanbul, Turkey, but at the time it was Constantinople. This is a 1422 map of Constantinople, and it was under the Emperor Constantine. It became the new capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and it became a great trading center. But of course, there was not that much trade in the western part of the empire, just in the eastern part where Constantinople was located. But Europe starts to rise. It undergoes a political and economic revival, if you will, a resurgence. So the question is, how did Europe rise after being so many years in decline? A lot of the rise is attributable or explainable by trade, long distance trade. Now, if you look at this map, it shows ancient Italy. And you can see there, it's a little hard to see in detail, but there are a lot of ports in Italy that have been, the Roman Empire, of course, was centered in Italy, in Rome. And so there was still a lot of trading ports there. It's just that the trading partners had changed. But it starts to revive. And revival of Western Europe was largely the result of long-distance trade from Italian ports and other factors. On this map, you can see the different products that are being made, the different trading networks that are being set up, mostly by water, a few overland along river routes. But you can see how Italian ports played an important role. So trade then starts to link Italy with what became Spain and Portugal and England and France and the Netherlands and so on. In order to facilitate trade, many people in what had been Western Europe under the Roman Empire began to think that they should form new nations, not another Roman Empire, but smaller, what we call nation states. Now, England was one of the first to do this. Now, this map shows us the geography of what came to be England. Now, England in the 9th century, as you can see, was made up of a lot of different independent parts. England as a modern nation state did not even exist yet. It was just a collection of these smaller independent pieces. Sometimes this system is called feudalism. This was a feudal system. But then England led the way to a more modern unified state when the King of England, King John, and the nobles, the wealthy aristocrats, began to cooperate as a result of the Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215. The Magna Carta set up a national government. It set up a national state called England and a national government called the Parliament. And the king and the nobles, the king and the lords, lords of the land, the kings and the lords agreed to work together and have a government. Power was given to the king. In exchange for centralizing power in the king agreed not to raise taxes or go to war without consulting the nobles. So there was consultation. So today, the Parliament still exists. You have the king, the House of Lords, the House of Commons was added later, but in order to have a national government, a nation state, you need a national government that makes it possible. So the Magna Carta then helped England become a more unified state when the kings and the nobles, or the lords, began to cooperate and established a parliament. Because a modern nation state, whether it's England or France, Portugal, Spain, United States, or whatever, a modern nation state needs a national government like the parliament. So you can see the smaller pieces are unified into a bigger, more cohesive England. Now, these new monarchies or new kingdoms that were created were very, the people who came to power were very ambitious, and they very much wanted to build their kingdoms, particularly in Spain, France, England, and Portugal. You can see on this map the new nation states and the new monarchies around 1560. Here you can, in the red, you can see England. The purple arrow shows France. The yellow arrow shows Portugal, and the black arrow shows Spain. So these new nation states have very strong monarchs. They're very ambitious. They want to suppress internal disorder, and then they want to raise taxes sufficiently to support their regimes. And when that happens, then they have economic revival, the population grows, and then if you add to those factors the emphasis in the Renaissance on human abilities, what people can do if they put their minds to it, if you will. All these factors encouraged these kingdoms to go out and to explore, to look for new markets, to look for longer distance trade, more profitable trade routes and trade locations and products. Now, the monarchs of England and Spain and Portugal and France, and later the Netherlands, had two primary goals to go out and explore. The first goal was to find an all-water route to China and what is today Southeast Asia, China, Japan, what today would be the Philippines, Indonesia, those areas, India. The problem with water routes is that not that many ships were sufficiently seaworthy to make the way there and back. But also, if you went across land, then those areas in Central Asia were now controlled by Muslims. And Muslims and the Christian nations of Western Europe were religious and commercial rivals. So those, if you bring the goods from China across that green road there, sometimes it used to be called the Silk Road. If you bring trade goods along that Silk Road, then they would be interdicted or taxed along the way. So European rulers were very anxious to get a water route. And a second goal, of course, was to go to West Africa and participate in the African gold trade to build up reserves of gold. This is a full model of a Portuguese caravel. According to one expert in London, this model illustrates the larger and later type of caravel having 4 masts. Portuguese ship captains used caravels like this, combined with a growing knowledge of at-sea wind patterns, to traverse the oceans of the known world. With this kind of technology and knowledge of the winds, developed in part by Prince Henry the Navigator from Portugal, Portuguese sea captains gained control of the African gold trade by 1500, colonized much of the East Indies, and reached China by 1513. Now, Spain and Portugal on the Iberian Peninsula were the first 2 nations to go out and explore. Spain, for its part, Spain made a very important decision to become a country, if you will, in 1469. That is the year that Ferdinand and Isabella married in sort of a dynastic or political marriage and united the independent kingdoms of Aragon and Castile and launched the golden age of Spain. Now, so Spain is very determined to go out into the world and to explore and to develop its trade. It so happens that Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailor, believed it was possible to reach the Indies or China, what was called the East Indies on your map here, by sailing west. That is, instead of going around Africa and across the Indian Ocean, Columbus believed that the world was round, like a sphere or a basketball, and you could sort of go around the backside, like these blue arrows show. So Columbus, an Italian, went to the Spanish court. He went to Ferdinand and Isabella, and he told them of his plan. He believed it was possible to go east by going in the other direction, by going around the back of the globe that way. This is a famous painting of Columbus in front of the Spanish royal court. And Columbus is explaining his plan and asking them to finance his voyage that he would take on behalf of the Spanish court. And Isabella agreed to finance it. Columbus obtained financing from Queen Isabella of Spain for a voyage in 1492. And after 70 days at sea, he sighted land, an island in the Bahamas. Its indigenous inhabitants were called Taínos, who are part of the Arawak people. Columbus thought he was in India. He thought he had hit India. In fact, he had not hit India. He was in the Bahamas, in what is today the Dominican Republic, the heartland of Los Angeles Dodgers baseball. But since he thought he was in India, he called the people who were there Indians. That's sort of the name stuck. Now, Columbus didn't discover America. It was already discovered. He sort of was a Johnny-come-lately, if you will. This is a very fanciful view of Christopher Columbus setting foot in what is now the Dominican Republic in 1492. On his second voyage, first of all, Columbus made 3 more voyages in his lifetime, and apparently he died convinced that he had reached the Indies. On his second voyage, Columbus's men captured some 1,600 Taínos on Hispaniola, and then carried 550 of them back to Spain as slaves in 1495. So Christopher Columbus then is the individual, the notorious individual, who began the transatlantic slave trade. And the European courts were amazed because Columbus showed them that it was possible to go to the Western Hemisphere, found colonies where climates were suitable for growing sugar and other profitable commodities like that. And he convinced them that Indians could be enslaved as a labor supply. This is titled Captive Indians Sold into Slavery. And as we said, Columbus and his men enslaved 1,600 Tainos, taking 550 of them back to Spain. So Columbus began the slave trade across the Atlantic. This is titled Hanging, Burning, and Clubbing of Indians by Spanish Soldiers. Two Flemish Protestants, appalled by the Indian murders at the hands of Roman Catholic Spanish soldiers, published these horrific, truthful images. And this is the Spanish were excessively cruel to American Indians. The exploration set in motion by Spain and other European nations had many important consequences economically. First of all, the commercial center of gravity shifted from the old Italian ports to the coastal ports on the Atlantic. That is, where most of the money and trade were located went from the old Italian ports over to England, to France, to Portugal, later to Amsterdam and the Netherlands. So the commercial center of gravity shifted to the Atlantic. Also, those Atlantic ports brought in a lot of money from the New World in silver, in gold, in commodities, setting off waves of inflation, financing further exploration, and so on. And there were also religious consequences because the Roman Catholic monarchs and the Catholic Church hoped that it would be possible to spread the Catholic religion in the New World and convert Indians to Roman Catholicism. Now, part of this is a little bit of a difficult point, so I'm going to try to make it clear. We're going to see that there were religious wars that took place in Europe that prevented or permitted different nations to go out and explore. Now, when the European nation states first came into existence, England, France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, and so on, most of these countries, all of these actually that I just mentioned, had kings who were Roman Catholics. Now, somebody watching this lecture may not know, I'm sure they know, but there may be somebody who is not clear. There are different kinds of Christians. Within Christianity, there are different kinds of Christians. Inside of Islam, there are different kinds of groups. You know, there are Sunni and Shiite and others, Sufis. And then inside of Buddhism, there are different branches, and inside of Judaism, there are different branches, and so on. Well, Christianity has, in the beginning, there were just Christians, and then there were Roman Catholic Christians in the 4th century, and then there were other Christians who came into existence at this time, calling themselves Protestants. They had been Roman Catholics, but they broke away and protested. Well, what happened is there were religious wars to determine, in some cases, there were religious wars to determine if a European state would continue to be Catholic or would now be Protestant. So there were religious wars that took place. Now, Martin Luther was a German Christian. In fact, he had been a Roman Catholic, but he protested religious corruption in the Roman Catholic Church. And so he started what is called Protestantism in Germany. Later it became the Lutheran Church. So Germany became Protestant, and there were others in England and Switzerland, places like that, who also challenged Roman Catholic as the state religion. Now, these are two paintings here. On the left is King Henry VIII of England, and on the right, Anne Boleyn, his second wife. Now, Henry VIII was over Catholic England. Roman Catholicism was the state religion. And Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife in order to marry Anne Boleyn, his second wife. The Catholic Church said no, would not give him permission. So Henry VIII became a Protestant and started his own church, or a national church called the Church of England, and made himself the head of it. So refused permission by the Catholic Church to divorce his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII started the Church of England. And so Henry VIII made Protestantism the state religion in England. Now, when the new kingdoms of Western Europe, as we said, England, France, Portugal, and Spain, first formed, Roman Catholicism was the state religion. These kingdoms competed to establish agricultural colonies in the Americas, but religious wars between Catholic and Christian Protestants in England and France distracted those kingdoms from exploration for almost a century. So notice the red arrow points to England, which had a religious war between Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians lasting for almost a century. And then in the red arrow, you have France, which also had religious wars between Catholic Christians and Protestant Christians. So those countries, England and France, were bogged down in religious wars. And because they were bogged down and distracted, they did not go out to explore until those religious wars were settled. In the end, England became Protestant and France became Catholic, or remained Catholic. Now you'll notice the blue circle on this diagram. That circles Portugal and Spain. Now, one of the reasons that Spain and Portugal were able to go out and explore is because they avoided religious war. And they did that. Spain and Portugal did not have religious wars because these Catholic officials in those two countries ruthlessly crushed fellow Christians. And so those two Catholic kingdoms enjoyed a 100-year head start in colonial exploitation of the Americas. As somebody once said, if you have a religious war, you don't explore. This is a painting of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when French Roman Catholics killed fellow Christian Protestant called Huguenots. This is Christian on Christian violence. And Christian on Christian violence, Catholics killing Protestants and Protestants killing Catholics, prevented France and England from exploration in the Americas, since those two countries were bogged down and distracted by religious wars that lasted almost a century. The Spanish and Portugal, Spain and Portugal, and Spain in particular, were able to crush Protestantism by beginning a Catholic church state institution called the Inquisition. The Inquisition used secret proceedings and judicial torture, burning its victims in public ceremonials. The Inquisition became an instrument of the Spanish crown's buildup of absolute power in the 16th and 17th century. Because the Inquisition crushed potential Protestant challenges to Catholic monarchical power in Spain and Portugal, these two Iberian nations were largely untouched by the Reformation. So Catholicism then crossed the Atlantic almost unchallenged. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were able to conquer the Western Hemisphere, and they did it almost unchallenged for a century. While England and France were bogged down in religious wars. The Iberian conquest of America. Iberia means the peninsula where Spain and Portugal are located. In 1494, Spain and Portugal concluded a treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas. That treaty drew a demarcation line that divided Spanish and Portuguese spheres of exploration in the Atlantic world. You can see this black line that goes sort of around the world like a basketball. And you can see, if you follow it down, that it's on the very bottom of your screen. It says with an arrow to Spain on the left, and then on the right to Portugal. Well, Portugal essentially removed itself from all the Western Hemisphere except for that eastern side of South America, which became Brazil. And Brazil, of course, was also the shortest distance between the Americas and Africa. But Spain took over everything else. You can see in the green areas on this map, how much Spain actually controlled by the 16th century. And we call this the Spanish onslaught. In the first half of the 16th century, Spanish conquistadores or conquerors seeking to serve God, get rich, and glorify Spain conquered most of South and Central America and the southern part of North America. Between 1519 and 1521, Hernando Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire. You can see in this drawing, here you see Hernan Cortez with his translator and mistress Malinche, known to the Spanish as Marina. Indian women at times have played crucial roles in the European conquest of the Americas. This is a map titled Route of the Spanish Conquest of the Aztec Empire in Central Mexico, used by Hernan Cortez and his troops, 1519 to 1521, from his landing on the water all the way to Tenochtitlan, or what is today modern Mexico City. This image from the early 16th century shows Cortez accompanied by Malinche, having conquered indigenous peoples in the Aztec Empire. And you can see on the right, there is Cortez and Malinche, and you see Spanish soldiers, and then following them, enslaved Aztecs. Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Mexica Aztec Empire, as shown in an image to readers in Europe 3 years after Cortez destroyed that great city. In the 1530s, Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro led the conquest of the Inca Empire in what is today Peru. In the map to the left, note the red line showing Pizarro's route of conquest. A little hard to see, but if you look carefully on that map from the top all the way down like that, you can see a red line showing his travels. This photograph from the Los Angeles Times in 2007 is titled Gunshot Wound. Peruvian archaeologists have identified the earliest documented gunshot victim in the Americas, an Inca warrior who was shot by Spanish conquistadores in 1536 in the aftermath of a battle now known as the Siege of Lima. So here we have concrete evidence of the Spanish conquest and the role that rifles and high velocity weapons played in that conquest. Horses had been largely absent from the Americas for nearly 10,000 years until they were reintroduced by Spanish conquistadores in the 1500s. Horses and rifles were instrumental in the European conquests. One Spaniard wrote, "Next to God, we owe our victory to our horses." And you can see here horses being offloaded from Spanish ships onto the North American mainland. By 1550, while England and France were still at war with each other, Spain controlled the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and the west coast of South America. Spanish ships carried gold, silver, dyewoods, and sugar to Europe and brought back African slaves, colonizers, and finished goods. For most of the 16th century, Spain's domination of the Western Hemisphere was almost unchallenged. Columbus's voyages showed the European courts, as we said earlier, that it was possible to go to the Western Hemisphere, found colonies whose climates were suitable for growing profitable commodities like sugar and later rice and tobacco or even cotton. And then Indians, Native Americans who were already in those areas could be enslaved as a labor supply. That was the original plan. The original plan following the Columbus voyages was to enslave Indians as a labor supply. What no one could have anticipated was an event historians call the Great Dying. Native Americans apparently had few, if any, immunities against the diseases that Europeans brought with them to the Americas, especially smallpox, yellow fever, and the measles. The results were catastrophic epidemics that killed 2/3 of the native populations. In this drawing, you can see Aztec victims of smallpox in Tenochtitlan, or modern-day Mexico City. One Spanish priest recalled years later, in 1781, that the smallpox spread like lightning through all the missions, not excepting the most distant ones, and caused havoc which only those who have seen it can believe. This iconic photograph shows a victim of smallpox in the early 1970s, shortly before smallpox was globally eradicated. But Native Americans didn't have immunity, much perhaps in the way that many people don't have immunity to COVID-19 today. This map is titled Native American Population Loss 1500 to 1700. In the areas that are light yellow, Native Americans had little contact with Europeans, and as a result, there was little, if any, population loss. Now, in the light green areas on the map where it says Northeast, that would be modern-day Eastern Canada, New France, the New England states. More than 40% of American Indians perished in those regions from European diseases. In the darker green areas, the present-day southeastern United States, more than 50% of Indians perished. And in the turquoise-colored area, the present-day southwestern United States, New Mexico, Arizona, those areas, more than 60% of Native Americans perished from European diseases. Spanish enslavement and brutal treatment of the natives only intensified the effects those diseases by weakening Native American resistance even further. Silver, sugar, and their consequences. This chart, or this table, tries to summarize the different ways that the Spanish and the Portuguese built an empire in the Americas. The Spanish focused not exclusively, but primarily on silver, while the Portuguese focused on sugar. The Spanish, as we have seen, tended to locate in Central America, Mexico, and we could add the Caribbean, while the Portuguese concentrated their settlements in Brazil. The main labor supply of the Spanish, not the entire labor supply, but the main supply were Native Americans. But the Brazilians, the Portuguese in Brazil, imported millions of African slaves into those regions. Spain's northern frontier. Spain's New World Empire was centered or headquartered in what is today Mexico City. So that's much further south. So the area on this map from modern day Florida to California was the top of New Spain. The center, of course, was Mexico City. So Florida to California like that was sort of the called the northern frontier. When no gold was discovered in the northern frontier, those areas became what we call a religious frontier, where Spanish missionaries looked for souls, not silver or gold. England looks west. England, toward the end of the 16th century, began to solve and resolve its religious wars. England resolved its religious war and became Protestant. France resolved its religious war and remained Catholic. Once those religious wars were solved, then England and France, and later the Netherlands, went out to explore. This painting shows the Spanish Armada, the Spanish naval fleet off the English coast. The English defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588, bringing at least a temporary stalemate in England's religious war with Spain, strengthening or solidifying Protestantism in England, and increasing the spirit of English nationalism. So England now, by 1588, is stronger, it's Protestant, and now wants to go out and explore. It had westward fever. Overseas expansion captivated or captured the imagination of many English people. England first colonized Ireland in the 1560s and 1570s. And their Irish experience, how the English acted toward the Irish, shaped their ideas of how to deal with what they called savage peoples. The English enslaved the Irish, and they used those same tactics here in the Americas. English colonization, England's exploration efforts in starting colonies in the Americas, supported by the king, but was undertaken with private financing by wealthy merchants. So Spain's colonies in the Americas were paid for by the government, but England's colonies were paid for by wealthy investors. Colonists also were needed, not just capital, but people to actually move to the Americas. Colonists were also needed. Change in economic conditions in England in the late 16th century produced a surplus of unskilled labor. English colonists thought the Native Americans were gentle people eager to receive them. This positive image reflected the European desire to view the Americas as an earthly paradise and a desire to trade with native peoples. Here you see Catholics in America planting a Spanish colony. But English painters and other Protestant painters in Europe wanted to provoke, if you will, English Protestants and Dutch Protestants by showing them that if Protestants did not go to America, then the Catholic Church would take over the New World. English colonists also wanted to make Protestant converts of Native Americans, blunting or thwarting, impeding Spanish Catholic efforts to do the same. Conclusion. Converging worlds. Early 17th century English and French immigrants came late to the New World. But like the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers before them, they would establish new societies in the Americas, often clashing with and sometimes cooperating with Native Americans and African slaves. That finishes lecture number 1, Three Worlds Meet. I appreciate very much your patience. I encourage you to replay this if there are parts that you are not sure about, if you're unclear about. And please feel free to email me if you have questions. I'll be happy to try to answer them. But I hope that this formative period in our country's history, at least to some extent, is more clear now after the lecture than it was before. Thank you very much, and look forward to our next lecture.